He inherited his grandmother's old house. At first, he thought he would just renovate it and sell it. But then he found something in the attic that changed everything. See how one discovery transformed the house from a mystery of the past into a place where life breathed again. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The dirt road stretched endlessly, winding between dry fields that once might have been seas of wheat. Now they were just brittle stalks whispering in the wind. The truck rattled as Thomas Grayson drove slowly toward the horizon, where the faint outline of a house rose against the gray autumn sky. The steering wheel vibrated beneath his calloused hands, and the sound of gravel under the tires was the only steady rhythm in a day that had felt otherwise empty. He hadn't been back here in over 30 years, not since he was a boy. Back then, the house had seemed enormous, full of warmth and smells of bread and old books. Now, even from a distance, it looked tired, like something waiting too long for a visitor who might never return. Thomas was 45, though his reflection in the dusty mirror on the dashboard looked older. He had the skin of a man who'd spent a lifetime under the sun-tanned, rough, and cracked at the corners of his eyes. The past few years had taken more from him than he cared to admit. The drought that had ruined his crops, the debts that followed, the marriage that had dissolved in quiet exhaustion. His son had gone off to college 2 years ago and seldom called. The farm he'd tried to build in another state had failed, and when the letter came about the inheritance, he hadn't even known how to feel. "You're the last of the Graysons," the lawyer had said on the phone. "The property is yours now." He hadn't wanted to come back, but when there's nothing left to lose, even a haunted place can look like a beginning. As the truck rolled up the last hill, the house revealed itself in full, a tall 3-story structure with faded white siding and a sagging roof. The porch rail was broken in one corner. The shutters hung unevenly. Yet the bones of the house were strong. It still stood against the wind, as stubborn as those who had built it. Around it stretched the old farmland, long overgrown with wild grass and saplings. The barn leaned to one side, and the well near the fence was sealed with a rusted iron lid. Thomas parked and stepped out. The smell hit him first. Earth, dust, wood that had been damp and dried 1,000 times. He breathed it in, unsure whether it comforted or unsettled him. The key was heavy and cold in his pocket. When he turned it in the lock, the door creaked open as though exhaling after holding its breath for years. Inside, the air was thick with stillness. The first step made the floor groan, and the second sent a faint shower of dust down from the ceiling beams. The smell of thyme of wood, paper, and faint sweetness from dried herbs clung to everything. His grandmother had always kept herbs hanging from the rafters in the kitchen, saying they protected the house. Now their ghosts remained, fragile and scentless. He walked through each room in silence. The kitchen was exactly as he remembered. A heavy oak table, a cast-iron stove, the old clock on the wall forever frozen at 12:07. A single teacup still sat on the counter, cracked but upright. In the living room, the curtains had fused with the window panes from years of dust and moisture. The air was stale, but the space held a strange dignity, as though it refused to decay completely. On the second floor, the light dimmed. The hallway smelled faintly of linen and cedar. He opened a door and stepped into what had once been his room. The small bed still stood by the wall, its mattress sagging but intact. On the desk lay an old drawing he'd done as a boy, 2 stick figures holding hands beside a house under the sun. He stared at it for a long moment, then folded the brittle paper and slipped it into his pocket. Everywhere he looked, time had paused, not stopped. The house wasn't abandoned, it was waiting. He found the attic stairs behind a door at the end of the hallway. The handle was stiff with rust. A padlock hung there, old and reddish-brown, but the latch had been replaced with a newer one, less corroded. Someone had cared enough to keep it sealed. He remembered his grandmother's warning from childhood. "Don't ever go up there, Tommy. The attic is for rest." Her voice, soft but firm, came back to him like a whisper. Back then, he had thought she meant it was full of old furniture or things she didn't want broken. Now, standing before it as an adult, the phrase felt heavier, deliberate. He stepped back, uneasy. There would be time to look later. First, he had to bring the house back to life. That evening, he found a half-empty bottle of bourbon in one of the kitchen cupboards and poured himself a glass. He sat on the back porch as the sun sank behind the hills, turning the sky the color of burnt copper. The air smelled faintly of rain. In the distance, a few lights from neighboring farms flickered, though the closest one was miles away. He felt small, surrounded by so much silence. For the first time in years, there was no hum of machinery, no chatter, no phone buzzing, just wind and the groan of wood settling. He thought about the people who had lived here before him, his grandparents, his great-grandparents, generations of Graysons who had worked this same land. His grandmother, Emma, had been a woman of quiet strength. She'd survived the war, the Depression, the loss of 3 children. When he was a boy, he hadn't understood why she spent hours every evening sitting by the window, watching the fields as the sun went down. Now he thought maybe she was counting the people she'd lost. When darkness came fully, he closed the door and turned off the single lamp in the kitchen. The house exhaled again, creaking and whispering, the sound of wood stretching after too much stillness. He climbed the stairs to the room he'd cleaned and lay down on the old bed. The mattress smelled faintly of dust and lavender. Sleep didn't come quickly. Through the thin walls, he could hear the wind pressing against the shutters. Somewhere above him, in the attic, something knocked softly. Perhaps a loose beam or a shutter moving in the draft. He told himself it was nothing. He had work to do in the morning. Days passed. He cleaned, repaired, painted. Each morning he opened the windows and let the light flood in, watching the dust swirl like gold in the air. The kitchen began to look alive again, the smell of fresh coffee replacing the must of neglect. He fixed the porch rail and reattached the shutter. With every nail driven, the house seemed to settle, as if approving. Sometimes he'd glance toward the attic door at the end of the hallway, still locked. He told himself he'd open it when he was ready. There was something about it, something patient, almost respectful. It didn't call to him, but it lingered, like an unanswered question. One afternoon, while clearing debris in the barn, he was startled by the crunch of gravel behind him. Turning, he saw a woman approaching slowly. Short, wrapped in a knitted shawl, her hair white as milk. Mrs. Collins. He remembered her vaguely from childhood, though she'd been much younger then. She smiled faintly when she saw him. "Well, I'll be damned," she said. "You look just like your grandfather." Thomas wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded. "You must be Mrs. Collins. I didn't think anyone still lived around here." "Some of us can't seem to leave," she replied, her eyes sweeping over the yard. "Your grandma, bless her soul, was the same way. Stayed till the very end." She handed him a basket covered with a cloth. "Apple pie. Don't eat it all at once. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." He smiled awkwardly. "Thank you. I'm still settling in." They talked for a while. She spoke of the old days, of how his grandparents had been the last to keep their farm running when everyone else had sold and left. "Your grandmother was different," Mrs. Collins said, her tone softening. "She didn't like going into town, said the house had everything she needed. I used to worry she was too lonely, but she always said she had company." "Company?" Thomas frowned. "Oh, you know how old folks talk," she said quickly. "She meant memories, I suppose. She'd tell me she never felt alone in that house. Always gave me a chill, that one. Thomas thanked her again and watched her leave down the road, her figure shrinking into the golden light. When she was gone, the farm seemed quieter than before. The idea of his grandmother spending her last years here, alone, climbing those stairs every day, weighed on him. What had she been doing on that attic? That night he stood in the hallway, staring at the locked door under the low ceiling. His reflection shimmered in the dusty window pane nearby, a middle-aged man with too many regrets. He reached out, brushed his fingers against the cold padlock, then drew his hand back. Not yet. For the next several days, the routine continued. He cleared the barn, repaired the roof, fixed the old windmill so it turned again with the breeze. But each evening, when the work was done, his thoughts returned to the attic. It wasn't fear. More a growing sense of obligation, as though the house expected something from him. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch watching the light fade, he found himself tracing the grain of the wooden railing with his thumb. Beneath the dirt, the wood was smooth, well crafted, built by hands that had believed this place would last forever. He thought of his grandmother again, of her bent back and quiet eyes, of how she used to tell him, "We don't own this land, Tommy. We just keep it alive long enough to pass it on." Now it was his turn. He looked up at the third floor, where the attic window was half covered by ivy. A gust of wind stirred the leaves, making the glass shimmer faintly in the fading sun. For a second, it looked like movement, a flicker, a shadow, but when he blinked, there was nothing. He stayed there until darkness swallowed the fields. Then he went inside, locked the front door, and sat at the kitchen table with the pie Mrs. Collins had brought. The crust was soft, the apples tart. For a fleeting moment, he almost felt at home. Upstairs, above the ceiling, something creaked softly. He paused, fork in hand, then smiled to himself. Houses settle, that's all, especially old ones. Still, as he climbed the stairs to his room later, his eyes drifted once more toward the attic door. The padlock glimmered faintly in the dim light. He hesitated, then turned away. There was always tomorrow. And so the house waited, patient as the land around it, holding its breath in the long quiet of the night. The days grew shorter, and the light that filtered through the windows turned the color of weak honey. Thomas had settled into a quiet rhythm, waking early, working on repairs, eating simple meals, and falling asleep to the creak of the old house as it expanded and contracted with the cold. The farm was slowly coming back to life. He had fixed the porch rail, cleared the yard, and even got the generator running again. Yet every night, when the wind rose and whispered through the eaves, he felt the same pull. The silent, steady presence of what waited above him. The attic. It had been nearly a month since he moved in, and though he had cleaned every floorboard and window, the third floor remained untouched. The padlocked door at the end of the hallway had become part of his daily view, something he passed without thought in the morning, but could not ignore at night. Sometimes he imagined that behind it was only old furniture, the relics of a past too heavy to throw away. Other times, when the air in the hallway felt too still, he thought of his grandmother sitting up there in her final years, talking softly to people who weren't there. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled faintly in the distance, Thomas decided it was time. He stood before the attic door holding a crowbar and a flashlight. The key to the old padlock had long been lost, and the metal had fused with rust. He hesitated, listening to the patter of rain on the roof, then slid the crowbar beneath the loop. With a firm pull, the lock gave way. The sound echoed through the empty hallway, hollow and final. The door resisted at first, the frame swollen with age. When it finally opened, a gust of air swept past him, dry and faintly sweet. carrying the scent of dust and wood, and something else, something old, but cared for. He lifted the flashlight. The beam cut through the dimness, revealing a vast space beneath the roof beams. Dust motes floated in the air, dancing like tiny ghosts in the light. The floor was lined with boxes, trunks, and he froze rectangular shapes arranged in a neat row along the far wall. He stepped closer, the boards groaning beneath his boots. The objects were wooden chests, narrow and long, each covered with a faded cloth. On the nearest one was a small metal plate, dull with age. He knelt and brushed away the dust. Letters appeared beneath his fingertips. Emma Grayson, 1914 to 1997, his grandmother. For a long moment he didn't move. The rain outside had softened to a whisper, but inside the attic the silence was complete. He stood, heart thudding, and moved to the next chest. Another name, Jonathan Grayson, 1909 to 1972. Then another, Louisa Grayson, 1883 to 1949. Each chest bore a name he recognized from family stories, stretching back generations. His hands trembled as he lifted the corner of one cloth. Beneath it, a simple wooden lid, sealed carefully with nails. No decay, no neglect. These were not random boxes. They were graves. He stepped back, dizzy. The flashlight beam wavered across the floor, catching on other objects. Small framed photographs, old letters tied with ribbons, dried flowers arranged in glass jars. Everything had been placed with care, as if this attic had been both a sanctuary and a secret. Thomas swallowed hard. His grandmother had spent her last years here, protecting something, honoring someone. He remembered Mrs. Collins's words. She said she had company. At the time, he had thought it strange. Now it made terrible sense. He found a wooden chair near the window and sat down, the air thick around him. The wind rattled the glass, and rain streaked down the panes. He tried to make sense of it. Why would she keep them here? Why not bury them properly? Was it grief or something deeper? Some stubborn refusal to let go? He thought of her small hands, steady even in old age, lighting candles in this dusty room. She had done this deliberately, not in madness, but in devotion. Hours passed as he explored. In a trunk beneath the window, he found letters. They were written in her careful, slanted handwriting. He carried them to the light and began to read. The first was dated 1972, the year his grandfather had died. They wanted to put him in the city cemetery, she wrote, but they don't know what it means to rest where you lived. I couldn't bear the thought of him out there among strangers. So he's here, where he belongs. In another, from years later, she wrote of loss again, her brother, her parents, friends gone one by one. The town had changed, the church had closed, and even the graveyard had been neglected. She feared that, in time, no one would tend to their graves. If I keep them here, she wrote, they will not be forgotten. The house will remember when I am gone. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his chest. The logic was heartbreakingly simple. She had done what she thought love required. He read on. The letters chronicled decades of quiet endurance, the wars, the failing crops, the winters spent alone. She wrote of the house as if it were alive, a keeper of her family's memory. In her final letter, dated only months before her death, she addressed him directly. If you ever find this, Tommy, don't be afraid. I only wanted to keep them close. But if your heart tells you to do otherwise, don't let my fear guide you. Let them go where they can rest under the sun. He sat there for a long time, the letter trembling in his hands. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the air smelled faintly of wet soil and pine. He looked around the attic again. It was no tomb. It was a shrine, built by love and loneliness. The thought brought tears he hadn't felt in years. When night fell, he descended the stairs slowly, carrying the letters with him. The kitchen felt colder than before. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the table, reading the letters again and again. Each line deepened his understanding, but also his unease. What she had done was tender, but it was wrong. People deserved rest in the earth, not behind locked doors. For the next few days, he avoided the attic. He needed time to think. He went about his chores, feeding the chickens that had begun to wander back to the property, patching a fence, checking the well. Yet no matter how busy he stayed, the weight of what he'd found pressed on him. Each time he looked at the house from outside, he felt as though eyes were watching from behind the attic window. Not ghostly eyes, but the heavy gaze of responsibility. At night, he dreamed of his grandmother sitting in that chair, the window open, talking softly to her husband, as though he were still there. When he woke, his pillow was damp with sweat. On the 5th day, he made his decision. He couldn't leave things as they were. Love should not be hidden. Remembrance should not smell of dust. If she had trusted him to find the truth, then he would honor it by doing what she could not. He drove into town that morning. The road was rough, and the sky was clear for the first time in a week. At the general store, people stared at him with polite curiosity. Some recognized the surname. When he asked about the cemetery, an old clerk gave him directions and a faint smile. "Not many Graysons left," the man said. "Would be good to see the name back on a headstone." Thomas spent the afternoon walking the small, unkempt graveyard on the edge of town. Grass grew tall between the stones, and the fence sagged in places. But the air was clean, the ground open, and the sunlight fell gently across the hill. Here, he thought, they could rest. Here, they could be seen. He arranged for a plot, small but enough for all of them, and ordered simple granite markers, each engraved with names and dates from the metal plates in the attic. The clerk asked if he wanted any epitaphs. Thomas shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Just their names. That's enough." That night he returned home to find the house darker than usual. The wind had picked up, brushing through the trees and making the walls murmur faintly. He climbed to the 3rd floor again and opened the attic door. The air was cooler now, the scent of dust stronger. He stood among the chests, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the names. "I'm going to take you outside," he whispered. His voice surprised him. It cracked, unsteady. "You deserve the sky." The following days were filled with quiet preparation. He gathered tools, polished the urns where they lay within each wooden chest, and cleaned the surfaces until they shone faintly in the light. There was no fear in the work, only care. He spoke little, even to himself. The house stayed silent, listening. One evening, as the sun slipped low and filled the attic with gold, he sat in his grandmother's old chair. He imagined her beside him, frail hands folded in her lap, watching as he worked. "You did your best," he said softly. "But it's time." When he finally went downstairs, the light was fading from the windows. He left the door to the attic open for the first time since he'd arrived. The air in the house shifted, lighter somehow, as if the building itself had exhaled. In the morning, he would take them to the cemetery. But that night, as he lay in bed, listening to the crickets and the rustle of leaves, he felt something close to peace. Not because the task was easy, but because it was right. The house had held its secret long enough. Now it was ready, as he was, to let the past rest beneath the open sky. Morning came softly, with a pale light sliding over the hills and spilling into the fields that surrounded the house. The air was cool and still. Thomas woke before the sun was fully up, the decision from the night before firm in his chest like a weight that no longer hurt. For the first time in months, he felt certain of what he had to do. The house was quiet, as if it too was waiting for him to act. The attic door stood open, and the faint scent of dust and old wood drifted through the hall. He dressed in silence, put on his worn boots, and gathered what he needed. The urns wrapped in fabric, a shovel, and a few simple stones he had polished by hand. He carried each urn carefully down the stairs, setting them in the bed of his pickup truck. The morning light caught the polished surfaces, and they gleamed faintly, like small suns waiting to rise. When he turned the key in the ignition, the engine hesitated before roaring to life. He looked at the house through the windshield. It stood tall and gray against the sky, its windows glinting with the reflection of dawn. He had lived long enough to know that places could hold memory, that walls could absorb laughter and grief, that every sound and silence became part of a home's pulse. Today, he thought, this house would finally be allowed to breathe. The drive to the cemetery took nearly an hour. The road wound through stretches of open land and thin forests, where the trees were bare except for the last copper leaves clinging to their branches. He drove slowly, careful with each turn, as though the weight in the back of the truck demanded reverence. The sun rose higher, washing the landscape in pale gold. For the first time in years, Thomas noticed how beautiful this part of the world was. Modest, forgotten, yet endless in its quiet dignity. When he reached the cemetery, the gate creaked open easily. The land beyond was uneven, with tufts of wild grass pushing through the earth. The stones were weathered, their inscriptions fading. Yet the place had peace about it, a simple kind of stillness that felt like rest. He parked under an old oak tree and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was complete. Only the wind moved, stirring the dry leaves. He unloaded the urns one by one, placing them gently on the ground. The shovel felt heavy in his hands. He began to dig. The soil was soft, dark, and fragrant with the scent of autumn. Each shovelful fell with a dull sound, and each movement seemed to ease the ache inside him a little more. Sweat gathered on his temples, but he didn't stop. When the holes were deep enough, he lowered the urns carefully, covering them with the earth he had just removed. He pressed the soil down with his palms, firm but tender, and placed the stones atop each mound. The names were simple, carved without flourish. Emma Grayson, Jonathan Grayson, Louisa Grayson. He read them silently, as if reciting a prayer. Then, standing with his hands dirty and his breath visible in the cool air, he said, "You're home now. Under the sky, where you belong." The wind answered with a long sigh through the trees. He stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the damp grass, feeling neither sorrow nor relief, only stillness. He had done what needed to be done. When he finally stood, the sun was directly overhead. The world around him was bright, alive. It struck him that, for the first time since he'd inherited the house, he didn't feel watched. The weight that had lived on his shoulders since the day he'd turned the key in that front door had lifted. He drove back in the afternoon, the truck lighter, the fields passing by in waves of color. When he saw the house again, it seemed different. The light caught on its windows in a way that made it look less like an old structure and more like something awake. He parked near the porch and sat there for a moment, listening. The air felt warmer, the silence no longer oppressive. He imagined his grandmother watching from somewhere unseen, smiling faintly, approving. Inside, the house was cool and calm. He climbed the stairs, stopping for a moment outside the attic. The door was still open, and the air that drifted down smelled of sun and wood, not decay. He went up slowly, his footsteps soft on the boards. The attic looked brighter than before. The empty space where the urns had been seemed vast now, filled not with absence, but with light. He opened the small window and let the breeze in. It moved through the room, stirring the dust into a golden mist. The sound of the wind filled the silence, and it felt like breath steady, living, content. Thomas spent the next few days transforming the attic. He carried down the remaining boxes, swept the floor, and washed the windows until the glass shone clear. Then he brought back only what felt right: the framed photographs, the letters, the worn chair by the window. He hung the portraits carefully, arranging them in a line along the wall, each one illuminated by the afternoon light. He placed his grandmother's Bible on a small table beside the chair, along with the stack of letters he had found. Then he installed a lamp with a warm amber glow. When he turned it on that evening, the attic no longer looked like a place of mourning. It looked like memory preserved with grace. He sat in the chair and listened to the creaks of the house settling around him. Outside, the wind played softly through the branches, carrying the faint scent of the fields. He imagined the lives behind each photograph, the laughter, the struggles, the ordinary days that had once filled these rooms. He realized that this was what the house had been waiting for. Not silence, not secrecy, but acknowledgement. A week later, his son arrived. Thomas hadn't expected him to come so soon. The boy, or rather, the young man, was tall and lean, with the restless energy of someone who hadn't yet learned how to be still. He parked his car beside the barn and climbed out, looking around with cautious curiosity. "So this is it," he said. "The famous Grayson place." Thomas smiled faintly. It's seen better days. His son followed him inside. They talked for a while in the kitchen over coffee, the conversation halting but sincere. Then Thomas said, "Come with me. There's something I want to show you." They climbed the stairs together. The younger man looked around as they reached the attic, his eyes widening slightly. "You fixed it up," he said. Thomas nodded. "It used to be different. Your great-grandmother kept it closed. I found some things here, family history, you might say." He gestured toward the photographs and letters. "This is everyone who came before us." His son walked slowly along the wall, reading the names written in neat script under each frame. "I never met them." "No," Thomas said quietly. "But they built this place. Every beam, every nail. They kept it standing, even when everything else fell apart." His son turned to him. "And you buried them?" "Yes. At the cemetery by the old oak. They're where they belong now." For a moment, the young man said nothing. Then he nodded. "That's good," he said softly. "That's right." Thomas felt something ease in his chest, something that had been tight for years. His son stepped to the window and looked out over the fields. "It's beautiful here," he murmured. "Peaceful." "It is," Thomas agreed. "Took me a while to see it." They stood there together in silence, watching the wind ripple through the grass. The light in the attic grew warmer as the sun began to set, casting long shadows that made the room feel alive. Thomas realized that this was the first time he had shared the space with anyone. It no longer felt private. It felt complete. In the days that followed, Thomas worked on the land. He repaired the barn roof, mended the fence, and planted a small garden behind the house. Each evening, as the sun dipped low, he would walk up to the attic, turn on the lamp, and sit for a few minutes in the chair by the window. Sometimes his son joined him. Sometimes he sat alone. There was no sadness in the ritual-only gratitude. The room had become a living memorial, a bridge between what was and what continued. As winter approached, the fields turned pale and quiet again. One night, as the first frost silvered the ground, Thomas stood in the attic, looking at the portraits, glowing in the lamplight. He thought of his grandmother's last letter, the one that had told him not to be afraid to do what was right. He realized that she had known all along that he would find his way here, that he would understand. The house had not been her prison. It had been her promise that one day someone would finish what she had started. He turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the dim glow of the moon through the window. "You can rest now," he whispered. "And so can I." Downstairs, the floorboards creaked softly as he walked to his room. He paused at the door and looked back toward the staircase, half expecting to hear the old house sigh. Instead, there was only silence. Peaceful, full, alive. The next morning, when the sun rose over the hills, the light spilled through the attic window and flooded the house below. It touched the walls, the floors, the kitchen where coffee steamed on the counter, and the garden outside, where frost glimmered like tiny stars. The house seemed to hum faintly in the warmth, every beam and nail alive with memory. Thomas stood on the porch, a mug in his hand, watching the light spread across the fields. The house behind him was no longer heavy with the past. It stood tall, breathing quietly, as if its heart had finally begun to beat again. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch our next videos to discover new stories every week. And don't forget to share this one with someone who loves a good story.